There is a small island off the coast of Alabama. It is 14 miles long, less than a mile wide in most places. It sits at the edge of the Gulf of Mexico, battered by hurricanes, soaked by oil spills, slowly being eaten by the sea. It has survived Katrina. It has survived the Deepwater Horizon disaster that coated its beaches in crude oil in 2010. It has survived storms that washed away more than 300 homes in a single night. It is called Dauphin Island, and right now, it is the center of one of the most heartbreaking wildlife battles in America. Not between humans and some distant, abstract species. Not in a rainforest or an Arctic wilderness. On a 14-mile strip of sand in Alabama, a community is tearing itself apart over a single question. Do you save the birds, or do you save the fox? Because the government says you cannot save both. A mayor signed a document. A federal agency was called in. Traps were set. And a man named Spence Harrison, a wildlife photographer who has spent years documenting the island's foxes, who knows them by name, who has watched them grow from pups, went to court, alone, against the town, the state, and the federal government, to save a fox named Roxy. This is happening right now, and it is one of the most extraordinary conservation stories in America today, because it asks a question that nobody has a clean answer to. When two species need the same piece of land, and one of them has a name, and a face, and a photographer who loves her. What does conservation actually mean? To understand what is happening on Dauphin Island today, you need to understand what has already happened to it. Dauphin Island, Alabama, sits at the mouth of Mobile Bay, at the southern tip of a state that most people don't associate with coastal wilderness. But this island is remarkable. It sits directly on one of the most important bird migration corridors in the entire Western Hemisphere, the Central Gulf Coast Flyway, a natural funnel through which hundreds of millions of migratory birds pass every spring and fall, traveling between their breeding grounds in North America and their wintering grounds in Central and South America. When exhausted migratory birds cross the Gulf of Mexico, a journey of 600 miles over open water, with no place to land and no food, the first land they reach is the northern Gulf Coast. Dauphin Island is often the first piece of solid ground they see. They descend in their thousands, sometimes their tens of thousands, dropping into the trees and scrub along the island's western end in a phenomenon that birders call a fallout. On the right spring morning, after a storm has forced down a wave of migrants all at once, the trees of Dauphin Island can be so dense with exhausted warblers, tanagers, orioles, and thrushas that the branches seem to move. It is one of the great natural spectacles of North America, and almost nobody outside the birding community knows it exists. The island's western end, a stretch of undeveloped dune, scrub, and maritime forests, is the heart of it. For years it was privately owned, ecologically valuable, but legally unprotected. Then, in 2010, the Deepwater Horizon exploded. April 20th, 2010. The Deepwater Horizon oil platform, drilling in the Gulf of Mexico about 40 miles off the Louisiana coast, suffered a catastrophic blowout. 11 workers died in the explosion. For 87 days, oil gushed from the uncapped well at a rate of up to 60,000 barrels per day. Nearly 5 million barrels of crude oil entered the Gulf of Mexico, the largest marine oil spill in United States history. The oil reached Dauphin Island. It coated the beaches. It killed fish and birds and sea turtles. It devastated the ecosystems that the island's wildlife depended on. And when BP eventually settled with the federal government and the affected states, hundreds of millions of dollars were earmarked specifically for the restoration of Gulf Coast wildlife habitat. Some of that money was used to do something conservation groups had wanted for years. In 2019, the Deepwater Horizon Natural Resource Damage Assessment trustees authorized funding to acquire the western end of Dauphin Island, the undeveloped, ecologically critical stretch of dune and maritime forests where the migratory birds land and protected permanently. The western end of Dauphin Island was now a federally funded bird sanctuary. The plan was clear: restore the habitat, protect the nesting sites, give the shorebirds and sea turtles that nest on the beaches the best possible chance to recover from everything the Gulf Coast had suffered. Fence the nests, guard the eggs, let nature rebuild. There was just one problem. The foxes were already there. Nobody is entirely sure exactly when the red foxes arrived on Dauphin Island. Red foxes are not native to the island. They are not, strictly speaking, native to most of coastal Alabama. The most likely explanation is that they were introduced intentionally or accidentally by humans at some point in the island's recent past, and that over the years, a small but stable population established itself along the western end, living in the dunes, hunting in the scrub, and becoming, for the people who noticed them, one of the most beloved parts of the island's identity. Spence Harrison is a wildlife enthusiast and photographer. He has lived on or near Dauphin Island for years, and at some point, he could not tell you exactly when it happened. Photographing the island's foxes stopped being a hobby and became something closer to a calling. He knows the foxes the way some people know their neighbors. He has names for them. He has watched generations of them grow up, pair off, raise pups in the dunes. He has photographed them in the early morning light on the beach, their red coats catching the gold of the Gulf sunrise. He has stood next to fishermen on the shore and watched the foxes trot up beside them, curious and unafraid, the way a fox can be on an island where it has never been seriously harassed. The most well-known of them all is Roxy. Roxy is a female red fox who has become, in Harrison's words, an ambassador for the island. Fishermen know her, early morning walkers know her. Locals and tourists alike have photographed her on the dunes. She is, by every account, a wild animal, but one so habituated to human presence that she will stand close to you and watch you the way a cat watches something that interests it, without fear and without particular concern. When the town of Dauphin Island signed a management plan for the Western End Bird Sanctuary, Roxy and every fox like her became a problem to be solved. The West End Bird Conservation and Development Plan is a federal document. It was funded by oil spill restoration money. Its purpose is to turn the western end of Dauphin Island into the best possible habitat for shorebirds and sea turtles, species that are threatened or endangered. Species whose populations were genuinely damaged by the Deepwater Horizon disaster. Species with legal protection under federal law. The plan identifies the red fox population as a primary threat to those species. And it is not wrong. This is the uncomfortable heart of this story, and it is worth sitting with. The foxes are not imaginary villains. They are predators. Real ones. Red foxes dig up sea turtle nests and eat the eggs. They raid shorebird nesting colonies and kill the chicks. Officials documented foxes climbing over the protective wire cages placed around sea turtle nests and getting inside. Photographs taken at night showed fox prints surrounding nests where cages had been placed. The mayor of Dauphin Island, Jeff Collier, did not sign the agreement to remove foxes because he hated them. He signed it because the data showed they were preventing the recovery of species that the entire conservation project existed to protect. Those tactics did not work very well, Mayor Collier said, referring to the fencing and protective cages, going on for several years now. And again, the ultimate goal is to get to a point where turtles and birds can both nest and be more successful, going forward and raising their hatchlings. In September 2025, Collier signed a work initiation document with the United States Department of Agriculture's Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service (APICS), authorizing them to trap foxes on public property and euthanize them. The plan was in motion. Spence Harrison found out, and he went to court. What Harrison did next is the kind of thing that most people talk about, but almost nobody actually does. He filed a civil complaint against the town of Dauphin Island. He sought a temporary restraining order to halt the fox removal operation. He found a judge willing to hear the case, and for a period of weeks in the fall of 2025, a single wildlife photographer. Not a lawyer, not an organization, not a funded nonprofit, but one man with a camera and a name for a fox succeeded in legally stopping the government of a town, a state agency, and a federal department from proceeding with their plan. The restraining order was granted. The fox removal was temporarily halted, and then the story got bigger. Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, the state's own wildlife authority, entered the case on the side of the town. Their attorney filed a document stating that individual citizens are not spokespeople for wildlife, and that the commissioner of a DCNR alone is charged by law with the duty to protect and manage wildlife in Alabama. In other words, you do not have standing to speak for the foxes. That is our job, and we have decided the foxes need to go. In court, attorneys for Dauphin Island showed the judge photographs they called a charcuterie board for foxes. A piece of driftwood laid with eggs, chicken, blueberries, and cookies, with a fox standing over it. The implication was clear. Harrison and others who had been feeding the foxes had made them bolder, more habituated to humans, more likely to approach the nesting areas, more dependent on the island. In trying to protect the foxes, the argument went, the people who loved them had made the situation worse. By late October 2025, a judge indicated he was prepared to side with the town. The restraining order was likely to be lifted. The fate of Roxy and the other foxes on Dauphin Island remained unresolved. It still does, as of now. Here is the question this story refuses to answer cleanly. Who is right? The people trying to save the foxes are not wrong that the foxes are living creatures with individual relationships with the humans who share their island. Individual lives that have value. Roxy is not an abstraction. She is a specific animal that specific people have watched and named and cared for. The emotional reality of that is not nothing. It is, in fact, one of the most powerful forces in conservation, the human capacity to bond with individual animals. To see them as individuals rather than statistics is what drives donations, what motivates volunteers, what turns abstract ecological concepts into things that people fight for in courtrooms. The people trying to protect the birds and sea turtles are not wrong either. The Deepwater Horizon disaster killed wildlife across the Gulf Coast on a scale that dwarfs the Dauphin Island fox population. Hundreds of millions of dollars in oil spill settlement money was designated specifically for the recovery of those species. The shorebirds that nest on Dauphin Island's western end are genuinely threatened. The sea turtles that lay their eggs on those beaches are genuinely endangered. The foxes are genuinely eating them. That is not a fabrication or an excuse. It is documented, photographed, and confirmed. This is the version of conservation that nobody puts on a bumper sticker. The wolves of Yellowstone were reintroduced and changed the rivers. A story of conservation triumph that feels unambiguously good. Mao killed the sparrows and triggered a famine. A story of ecological destruction that feels unambiguously wrong. The emus defeated the Australian army. A story that feels, from a distance of 90 years, simply funny. But Dauphin Island is different. Dauphin Island is a story where both sides are right, where the conservation plan that is trying to save threatened birds was itself born from a disaster. An oil spill that devastated the coast, where the foxes that are destroying nesting habitat are themselves animals that do not deserve to die for, arriving on an island where humans either placed them or allowed them to stay, where the man who went to court is not fighting against conservation. He is fighting for a different definition of what conservation means. Does conservation mean protecting the species the law prioritizes, or does it mean finding a way to protect all of them? There are voices in this debate who say the answer is relocation rather than euthanasia. Move the foxes. Find sanctuaries willing to take them. Remove them from the western end without killing them. Harrison's petition on change.org gathered thousands of signatures from people who believe this is possible. Wildlife advocates have pointed to relocation programs in other states where fox populations were successfully moved away from sensitive nesting areas. The town says relocation is not practical. The foxes would need to go somewhere. Most wildlife facilities do not accept adult wild foxes. The cost and logistics of relocating an entire island fox population to destinations that may not exist, while continuing to manage a federal bird sanctuary, is beyond what a small island municipality can coordinate. Both things are probably true. And in the gap between them, Roxy is still on Dauphin Island, walking the dunes in the early morning, standing next to fishermen, watching the Gulf with the patience of an animal that has never been given a reason to fear humans. She does not know about the court case. She just knows the island, the dunes, the smell of fish, the sound of the Gulf. As of early 2026, the legal battle continues. Harrison has not stopped. People who have never seen Roxy, who may not be able to find Alabama on a map, keep signing the petition because the story of a man who went to court alone with nothing but photographs and a name has touched something that conservation reports never quite reach. The ability to look at a specific, named animal and decide that its life matters. Not as a statistic, not as a species, as a life. Whether it will be enough to save Roxy is a question that remains open. Whether it should be, that is worth spending some time with. What do you think? Should the foxes be removed to save the birds and sea turtles? Or should every effort be made to relocate them humanely? Tell us in the comments. And subscribe because every week, the true stories are more complicated more human, and more worth knowing than anything on the front page.